That's impressive. What a fantastically trained audience that you've just gone quiet without me having to do a thing. Now, I'm just going to wait and see. I've got a heads up from the technical people over here. We're right. Welcome, everyone. What an exciting opportunity for us today to be a part of a panel discussion, to have three fantastic panellists and an opportunity for all of you to be able to join in a conversation with us about health promotion and what does the future hold. We've got a lot of distinguished guests here today, so I'm not going to name them all, but it's so wonderful to have several of our previous chairs, our current chair of the board, Vic Health board members, many of our Vic Health partners and friends, a number of our staff are here, but most importantly, we have a number of students who are going to be those health promotion champions of the future. And we've got another audience as well, because we've got this fabulous venue that's allowing us to stream this through the Vic Health Facebook page as well. So I'd really like to welcome our viewers that are linking in with us that way today. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands in which we meet today and pay my respects to elders past and present. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Lynn Roberts, and I have the great joy and pleasure of working in a part-time capacity as a principal advisor to Vic Health. What that really means, I get to choose what I want to do and I give advice and people either take it or they don't. It's just honestly, if you want a career aim when you get to this stage of life, I can absolutely and entirely recommend it. I want to spend a minute or two just talking about process, and then we're going to get underway. So as I said, we're going to hear from the panellists just quite quickly, a few minutes each, to sort of set the stage for the discussion. But we really do want to have a dialogue and be able to have some questions from the audience here, to be able to do that with our Facebook audience. And there's an opportunity with the mobile number that's up there, that if you're a bit shy about putting your hand up in this particular audience, then you can also text in some answers as well. We've got a couple of roving mics. Adam's on one and John on the other side here around. We will ask you to use the microphones. This room's quite long and it will be important so that we can actually hear what you're really asking the panellists to comment on. I'm going to actually, from time to time, probably cut across the panellists, because what we want is a bit of a question and an answer and not some really long answers. So they've all given me permission to politely cut them off if we have to. So don't worry, I'm not offending any of them. And I think importantly for the audience as well, can you please ask questions rather than actually have a comment? I think if you wanted to catch up with people and have some of that sort of discussion, we can do that at the end of the session. Now, I think that probably means I've covered off all of the housekeeping issues that I needed to do. So now what I really would like to do is just acknowledge our fantastic panellists and say how delighted we are. Gerald, as many of you would know, is the CEO of Vic Health and chair of the International Network of Health Promotion Foundations, along with many other things that she's engaged with. I also wanted to tell you that we were talking coming down in the car that she's got one more month to go of 12 months of not buying any new clothes. And she's done really well because she's looked incredibly elegant for all that year and rediscovered her wardrobe. So, but I'm sure she's looking forward to that year coming to an end. Sandro, as you would know, is the co-founder of NCD Free and the medical officer for non-communicable conditions and nutrition at the Department of Nutrition for Health and Development at the World Health Organization. A bit of a TV star, range of other sorts of things that he gets up to, and we're just so thrilled that you've flown in from overseas and via Indonesia and in here today. We did have a little moment's panic about whether the plane would arrive on time, but you're here. Sandro also, I'm led to believe, is about to and in the process of developing a cookbook, which is 90 of his own recipes, which is going to be launched in June next year. So I think that's something to really look out for. Rob doesn't really need any introductions, does he? Professor of Public Health at the University of Melbourne School of Population Health and Global Health, former Vic Health CEO, has been just such a dominant, fantastic leader in health promotion, both here in Australia and globally. And one thing that some of you will know, but not everyone will understand about Rob, is that over the last 2 years, He's demonstrated his commitment to public health, particularly in developing countries, and he's spent time in Malawi as the Professor of Public Health and has a commitment to continue that work over the next 5 to 10 years. For those of you that don't know where Malawi is, and I had to check it today in terms of where it is in Africa, it's in sub-Saharan Africa. So a wonderful panel that we've actually got the opportunity to hear from. So without any further ado, I think we just might get right into it. So Gerald, I wondered if you'd like to start and spend perhaps a few minutes talking about the story of health promotion, what you're really proud of from a Vic Health perspective, and maybe touch a little bit on the importance of partnership to just get the ball rolling.
Thanks, Lynn. And I would also like to extend my welcome to everybody here today and acknowledge the traditional owners of the land. It is wonderful to be sitting beside these two fantastic people. As many of you would know, Rob actually wrote a cookbook, and now Sandro's writing a cookbook, so I'm feeling very left out, I must say. So I'm going to address that in the next 12 months, without a doubt. As you know, Vic Health this month was founded 30 years ago, and as our founding chair, the fabulous Gus Nossel, said, where did those 30 years go? That is just an incredible amount of time to pass, but also it's a blink of an eye. And it's a wonderful achievement for not just Vic Health, but for every single person in this room and all of the lives that we get to touch and work with. So we are celebrating this month our 30th anniversary, and our work has benefited so many people over the last 3 decades. And I think one of the powerful pieces of Vic Health is that many people would not even know that their life has been touched by Vic Health, that they're actually living healthier, happier lives as a result of the work we do with our partners. And again, I think that's a great success for the organisation. Our role is to champion the health and wellbeing of all Victorians, and that means that we are preventing chronic disease, keeping people out of the health system, but we do have a really particular focus on equity and a health equity lens. We've always had that, and it's very germane, I think, to us as an organisation and us going forward into the future as well. When we were founded 30 years ago, Victoria was an incredibly different place. You wouldn't have been able to walk into this building without probably walking through a wave full of, smoke-filled either restaurants, or you would have been coming out of your workplaces, and they would have been smoke environments as well, pubs, bars. It was just more of a normal environment. Sponsorship of sports and the arts by tobacco companies was rife, and again, it was just part of the norm. Mental health was something that wasn't talked about. It was actually something quite in the shadows, and it wasn't even considered a public health issue. And the same for violence against women and family violence. That was absolutely not talked about and not thought about as a public health issue. And nobody thought also about preventing violence before it happens. And here we are now, 30 years later, thinking about health and wellbeing quite differently. And I think if you think about the successes of buying out tobacco sponsorship, Quit, the SunSmart campaign, now that mental health is out of the shadows, now that prevention of violence against women is considered something that is something we all have a responsibility for, I think you can look back on the legacy of Vic Health and see what great successes that we have had over those 30-year period. And I think one of the key components of our work is to be an organisation that can strategically set agendas. We look at what is coming up over the hill and we look at those new things that are happening on the horizon. And I know we're going to be talking about some of those things like obesity during today's panel. And our work has evolved very much over those 30 years. When we started out 30 years ago, we had about the same budget that we've got now, and we had one topic that we looked at, and that was buying out tobacco sponsorship in sports and arts. 30 years down the track, we are still working on reducing harm from tobacco, but also we're looking at promoting healthy eating, increasing physical activity, reducing harm from alcohol, and also improving mental wellbeing. A huge area of work that we are focusing on. But all of that, and you can see the enormity of the task that is in front of us, we can't do that without our partners, and we are fiercely proud of our partners, and we love them, actually. We talk about you in glowing ways back in the office. The partners that we get to work with, all levels of government, the not-for-profit organisations that we work with, sports, arts, research, academia, media, the private sector, all those individuals and health promoting organisations that are so strong here in Victoria. We know that we can't do our work without you, and we thank you very, very much. And I think Vic Health is that organisation that is a living embodiment of what partnership actually means. As you probably all know, we're a statutory agency. Still, true to our core in the Tobacco Act, we have 3 members of the major political parties on our board. We have board members from many of the sectors in which we work with. And so we've got that constant view of partnership in every single thing we do, and the lens about how we look about our work. And we want, if we think to the future, we want future generations to be able to have a world that is better than when we've left it. And our aim is to have 1 million more Victorians with better health and wellbeing by 2023. And again, we can't do that without the partners that we have. A lot of you are here in the room, a lot of what you are watching online, and we really do thank you for all of your work. As Lynn said, it's just fantastic to look out. This event booked out within 48 hours of actually us sending it out online. So we've got more than 200 people in the room here today, standing room only. We've got the online crowd as well. And if I look out and see that interest, I think the future of health promotion feels pretty bright, Lynn, would be my sense.
Thanks, Gerald. That's terrific. I wondered, Sandra, if you'd like to comment about the sort of more of the public health challenges facing us globally and the experience that you've had with WHO.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. And first of all, thank you all for making the time to come along.
No,
I'm used to having a booming voice and not needing a microphone, but great. So thanks. Thank
Brilliant.
you.
It's okay.
Thank you. Thank you for making the time to come out today, and also thank you to Vic Health. And there are some heroes that I've followed most of my career, faces up, looking up at us from the crowd that I've followed most of my career. So it's quite humbling to be up on stage and having this opportunity to talk to you all today. I think the challenge of trying to, talk about all of or most of the global health challenges facing the planet without spending the entire hour is too great. So, I think I'll maybe just focus on the challenges that I've been looking at this week, let alone this month or even this year. I've just landed this morning from Jakarta. I was there with 800 experts, politicians, members of all different sectors, trying to use the convergence of food and food systems, health and climate change to find new ways of solving all three, and also beyond. We have some enormous global health challenges that we're trying to address. Just to name a few: antimicrobial resistance and the challenge of making sure that we have effective antibiotics, but also how do we address the fact that 70% of all global antibiotic use is used in animal production. Conflict. We found out this month that in fact world hunger is once again on the rise, driven by climate change and conflict. Hunger and malnutrition. 830 million people on the planet are hungry. In 2017, that's completely unacceptable. But at the same time, 1.9 billion people on this planet are now overweight or obese. We have, a new nutrition paradigm, new nutrition reality in most countries on the planet, including our own, one of what we call the double burden of malnutrition. We have hundreds of thousands of Australians who are overweight or obese and yet deficient of important micronutrients, vitamins and minerals, because our diets are calorie rich but nutrient poor. I've written down a few notes, but the challenge that we have is that we now have set ourselves a very ambitious global agenda, the SDGs. We have 12 years to reach 17 goals and 169 targets. And at face value, these all sound like very complex, unrelated challenges. But I think what many of us are realising is that as you take more and more of a step back from this kind of picture of mayhem and quite a frightening sort of future, you realise that in fact many, if not most, of our global challenges are linked. And so what are those linkages? Where are the common opportunities? Where are the converging opportunities? And how can we use the theme of innovation, which to me, when I think of Vic Health, I think of innovation. I think of rethinking how we do health promotion and what is health promotion. How do we reflect that in 2017, and what does a fit-for-purpose public health professional and approach look like in 2017? In particular, so we've talked about climate change, antimicrobial resistance, conflict, malnutrition, NCDs, of course, and then there's global pandemics. And again, the lesson from this week was that in fact all of those come back to what we do or don't eat as a planet. A third of the food we produce is wasted, 2 billion people are overweight or obese, 800 million are hungry, 70% of our antibiotics are used in the food system, most of the water is used in the food system, and yet water scarcity is a major problem. All of these things, in fact, come back to what we do or don't eat. But then if you go even deeper, they're a reflection of globalisation, of urbanisation, and of demographic shift. 50% of the planet is now under 30. What does that mean for public health? How do we turn that into an opportunity? Those people have an interest, have a direct vested interest in making sure the planet is around in 30 years because they'll be living on it. They'll be the leaders on it. Whereas some others may not have the same direct vested interests. So you look down a level and you realise that there are these three major drivers that actually are underpinning the transitions and the challenges that are driven by food, which is underpinning, again, all of these major and seemingly disparate global health challenges. And then one level down again, you realise actually what's underpinning many of the challenges of globalisation, of urbanisation and of demographic shift is in fact an unfair and untruthful economic system and economic approach. And so then what do you do with that? I suppose the other reflection I would have that we're currently, that I think we as a community need to reflect upon, and again come back to the idea of innovation, and Rob's going to talk more about this in a second, but is one of power and accountability in our current societies. The way that a democratic system is meant to function, if you think about the different blocks, government is meant to set a kind of a fair playing ground and policy that protects public health, the public support and elect the politicians. The private sector has a certain role, and then the scientists and everyone else, the other sectors also have a specific role. But as you start to reflect and think, well, in a perfect world, how does a democratic system work? And then in reality, how are our democratic systems working, and how does that relate to those different levels of the kind of root causes of disease on the planet? You start to realise that actually it's not just those challenges that are converging, but also one of global economic inequality and the concentration of power and economics. 8 people on the planet now own as much wealth as half of the entire population. Well, what does that mean for our political systems? What does that mean in turn for health? And how are all of those things linked? So I'm going to stop there, but more just to start the conversation, and hopefully these are things that everyone is already thinking about, but we have some major global health challenges. Things are getting worse, not better in most of them. There are converging opportunities, but also a concentration of threats, and we need to be thinking, I think, how do we develop new public health approaches that are fit for purpose in this new global health paradigm?
Thanks, Sandra. Rob, now there's lots of food for thought there for you.
So to speak.
Yes. But I wondered if you'd like to just talk to us a little bit about what you see are the challenges of health promotion for the future.
Okay, well, I'd quite like to focus on the role of different sectors within the community and particularly the private sectors, not the private sector, but the private sectors, industries, because they're enormously important, as Sandro was alluding to, an enormously important part of our community and part of our setup. The question is, just to start with, that often we talk about the private sector, and my belief is that there are so many, it's hugely diverse. And if we're looking at health promotion, then there are an enormous number of sectors that we can work with very actively. Now, that might be the insurance sector, it might be the finance sector, the banking, telecommunications, lots of areas where we can work extremely constructively with. There are, however, some industries that are incredibly unhealthy. And they, to me, are the industrial vectors of these diseases that we're talking about. If we're talking about obviously tobacco-related, alcohol-related, poor diet-related diseases, then these are the vectors. It's not terribly different from the mosquito that's causing malaria or Zika. And in that sense, we understand a lot more about the life cycle of the malaria parasite than we know about the life cycle of Coca-Cola. And we have to start to understand them because they are so powerful now, and we're seeing a major transition in power and who has it now, whether that's financial power, industrial power, or political power. Of the 100 biggest economies in the world, 61 are now corporations. And this is changing quite dramatically over the last few years. Walmart has a bigger revenue than Australia. Walmart. And, you know, if I've been living in Malawi, I mean, they have no capacity to resist, to work with, to challenge industry in any way at all. I mean, the top biggest 10 corporations, in a sense, have more revenue than 180 of the least strong countries. So this is where power is shifting. It's not meant to say that it's either good or bad. It's what's happening. We have to learn about it. We have to work with it. Because if we don't, then we can't possibly manage the sort of political processes. I knew that when I was the chair of the Preventative Health Task Force and Mike Daub and Lynn were working with me, I had the pleasure of working with them, so that every time we would see the minister, we knew that the industry had met the minister before and after we'd been there. So it's a question of us learning about them. That's why I'm convinced that we really need to advance the science of corporatology. I'd like to sort of officially announce that today. That this is, in a sense, understanding what we need to understand about their life cycle, but also understanding what we can really learn in public health from really good business practice. I probably have learned more in public health from working with a man, Ashok Alexander, who was the lead partner for McKinsey's in India, who ran the biggest HIV prevention program in the world, than I have from anybody else in public health. We have an enormous amount to learn. We can learn from them. On the other hand, we really need to learn where the damage is being done. And as I say, learn about these vectors. It's really interesting. Sandro mentioned the Lancet Countdown report on climate change came out this week, and it was launched here and 30 other places around the globe. And it was interesting. At the same time, there's a brilliant analysis done on the 250 biggest corporations in the world and what's their climate carbon footprint. And they've analysed this, in a sense, gone from given a score of -100 to those that are doing the most against it, to +100 who are really working for climate mitigation and climate adaptation. What you find is 200 in the middle, virtually doing nothing either way. But you find 35 actively working against it. Not surprisingly, headed by the Koch industries in the US, who are really out of this and really trying to, in a sense, stop any work done on climate change. On the other hand, you have ones working very positively. Apple's at the front, actually, in terms of their own attitudes and practices around climate mitigation and climate adaptation. And that's, in a sense, working out, well, how do we shift some of those industries so that's in their interest that we're talking about in say in food or alcohol, how do we shift it so that, in a sense, we've got more working in the green space around climate, but around healthy living, if you like, and less in the red space. So I think there are enormous challenges for us. We need digital strategists working in public health. We need public health lawyers. We need investigative journalists, researchers. We need business analysts. We need to partner with a different group of people. That's where our future lies. Because if you watch what's going on in the digital space in terms of advertising, completely unregulated, all of your children are being attracted into it, whether you like it or not, because they're far faster than smarter than you are. But the point is, we need to be able to work it. As my classic story is that of Mercedes-Benz. So if you like Mercedes-Benz on Facebook, and you tick it, and you're a male, and you happen to be married, and then you change it to being unmarried, then immediately you change it, you get an invitation to drive a red open-top Mercedes. You sign, and we've never seen this before, digital advertising, we've never had this before where it's self-enhancing. So when you, for example, you like a product on Facebook, then they know 98 bits of information about you, which will then be given back to the people who are buying the advertising space so they can get to you in a much more targeted way. Now, whether that's good or bad, it's happening. We've got to learn, we've got to be able to work in this rapidly changing environment. And I just say to the students in the room, get into this. This is a wonderful area. Do you know what's on our side? Evidence, persistence. Safe injecting facilities got up this week, by the way. Yep. Took us 20 years. Evidence, persistence, courage, wit and humour. And Mike's got a lot of those, Daub. But it really does make a big difference. It's a really exciting area to work in. I've been working with some absolutely brilliant young researchers who are working in the area of mapping what Nestlé does with Milo in 50 countries, how they're sponsoring sports in 38 of those countries, or how Coca-Cola's working, or how Melissa Mowlin's working on a whole sort of structure of how to understand the industry. We need, as I said, public health lawyers, talk to your lawyer friends, get them into public health. Well, we need them now because the corporations are now getting big in-house lawyer groups. They can intimidate us. We've seen one this week with a case, I'll stop in a minute, Aristocrat and Crown versus one woman that was actually claiming that her gambling dependence was dependent on a neuropsychologist got up to give evidence, and I mean, he'll never do it again. I mean, he was so intimidated by, in a sense, the lawyers. He was an expert. He got absolutely ruined. We've got to be able to protect people like that. Anyway, I'll leave it at that, Lynn, before I get too excited. Thanks.
Rob, fantastic. Well, look, I think that's set a really great platform for some discussion. So I'm sure there's lots of questions that you'd like to raise. So let's start in the room. If you can just wave your hand so we can get a microphone to you. And as I said, can we stick to questions rather than comments so that we can get through as much of this as we possibly can? Oh, everyone's just going to go a little shy. Or do we have something that's come in? Anything?
Yes.
Okay, we'll start with Adam then. With something.
So there are a few questions on Facebook and being texted through about where the future will go for tackling obesity at a local level and in regional areas.
In Victoria?
Yes.
Okay. Cheryl, do you want to comment about that at all broadly?
Look,
Rob?
I think
You go.
all of us can have a go at that one. Certainly obesity has already been laid out. As we all know, and I think as Sandro talked about, is one of the greatest health challenges that we're facing. And at a local level, we've got to be able to do much better at being able to, I guess, help people not only understand the challenge that they're facing, but also provide the environments in which they can make those healthy choices. And that means we need to make changes, and that is changes in legislation, that's changes in policies, et cetera, et cetera. I think that some of those things that we know about obesity also certainly at the local level are happening in other areas as well, which Rob talked about. So if we think about that globalisation piece and we think about those unhealthy industries like tobacco, alcohol, junk food and gambling, there is a reason why they are so prominent in disadvantaged areas, and that is because there's great money to be made by those industries selling unhealthy products to people who can least afford it and who are most vulnerable. And so protecting those people in our community that are vulnerable is incredibly important, which is why you need the policy environment, you need the policy change to be happening. But also I think the other piece, and something certainly we've been working at quite strongly at Vic Health, is really being able to help people make those choices as well. So the environments need to be there. And if I just give one example at that local level and things that people may not know that we're working on, we've been working with sports organisations across Victoria, building fantastic evidence around how those sports organisations that are small, under-resourced, can actually start to be really driving healthy choices for the people that are playing their sports, that are participating in their sports, that may be coaching, maybe attending their grounds. And we've got some great work actually on our website where you can go and have a look at some of the evidence that we've been building in collaboration with Deakin University to show at that grassroots level that there are things that your local club can do to actually help change the behaviour of the people that are coming through the doors. It means the sports club can still get the money that they need to get, and that's always a real concern. And I think it's incredibly important to remember that actually, you know, often we sit in an ivory tower as public health professionals and we forget the on-the-ground reality for sports clubs that they also need to be making money. So there are ways that you can actually be nudging people to be making those healthy choices. There's lots of evidence that we've been building, and we've been getting some great work with sports clubs, also local government, and organisations like the YMCA as well. But
Great. And I think we should acknowledge the fantastic work of the Obesity Policy Coalition and the support that's there and the group of people that are working in that area. So I think we should probably move to the next question.
Can I just quickly
Yes.
add something?
30
I was going to
seconds.
say the same. Shout out to Jane Martin. Also, I mean, ultimately, agree with what you said, Gerald, but ultimately obesity is a political challenge,
Yes,
not
absolutely.
a technical one.
Yep.
We know what the solutions are. We need to actually give politicians the coverage and the urgency and kind of no other choice but to act. We can see that based on evidence from around the world. You look at Chile and what they're doing in front of pack labelling. You look at the UK and their announcements with marketing to children. There are Mexico and the sugar tax. There are countless examples, even in Australia, New South Wales Health, taking sugary drinks out of the health service. There are countless examples of where they've been able to make really bold action and progress. No jurisdiction in the world has reversed the global obesity or local obesity trends. Indonesia this week, it has doubled obesity in the last decade and still 37% stunting. No one has the complete solution, but ultimately it is a political challenge and not a technical one. And so we need to be looking at where action is happening and better analysing why is it happening there, what can we learn and what can we apply here. And I think it comes back to the same things that Rob was talking about. Power and mapping power in society and trying to work out where we can disrupt power that's flowing in the wrong direction or for the wrong rationale and the wrong incentives. It's about a lack of accountability. It's about a lack of coalitions. We need to be, I think, working much more closely together also across aligned sectors. As I said before, many of the major challenges that, you know, climate change, huge shared opportunities with the obesity agenda. There is not enough discussion happening between the two communities, and we will easily be divided by the powerful vectors that Rob talked about. So we need to be building those coalitions. And ultimately then, as I said, you know, one of accountability.
Yep, brilliant. Okay, question from the audience? Here we go.
Jane
What a
Martin.
surprise, Jane.
go,
Oh,
Jane.
Jane.
Jane Martin. I'm interested, you know, fantastic discussion, great insights of what we need to do more of. We're all pretty squashed and time poor. I'd love to get your insights on what should we be doing less of.
Good question. Rob, do you want to
can
tackle that
I'll
one?
just jump straight in. One is less protecting of our own turf.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, so less identification with our own company logo, and I'll say this, from University of Melbourne. And I just want to do a shout out to Deakin University for the fantastic work they are doing in obesity, particularly at community level. Steve Allen's work, where they're actually showing reversal. So I'm really impressed. But I think in terms of how do we work as coalitions much more strongly with, so that we're aligning our activities, that we're doing less fighting. We're trying to make, and I pay great tribute to Gus Nossel here, we're making the pie bigger. Instead of fighting over a smaller pie, how do we collectively make the pie bigger? That's where I would change our...
And I would add, relating to the pie, and not necessarily the question, I'm sorry, but we...
Well, it is lunchtime.
But coming back to innovation, the way we do public health at the moment, that pie is only going to get smaller and smaller.
Exactly.
There are very powerful countries on the planet that would love to see parts of major agencies, UN agencies, government agencies disappear. Okay? There are countries on the planet that would love to see entire portions of certain agencies or governments disappear. Now, we need to find new ways within the system, within the power and accountability structures that we've already talked about, of funding health promotion and funding public health. And at 1.5% of a 6 or 8% health budget, that's never going to be a big enough pie. So coming back to, this is not to spruik my book at all, I promise, but coming back to, it was a very strange situation where I was asked to write a book. I didn't want to write a book on the food system because there are far more qualified people to be doing that, even here in Australia and in Melbourne. But I realised that by writing a cookbook that is heavily focused on what I know about the science and evidence of good nutrition in a way that reaches everyone and is going to be sold majoritively through Kmart and Big W and those sorts of stores, very powerful audience that I want to try and reach. Not only will that hopefully put tools and solutions in people's hands, not only will it also raise money, but it will also raise the political priority for that issue. And I suddenly realised that we could actually do all three, and then with the revenue, which is quite substantial potentially, do something really interesting. And it's the same with, I think, trying to find new ways. For me, it's an example of health promotion. So how could we find different ways of doing health promotion within the system, finding the good parts of the private sector, of the capitalist approach, and finding ways of achieving what we want to, whether that's with the health insurers or aligned parts of the private sector or elsewhere, to create revenue so that good organisations can continue to grow and do the work that they need to do, but at the same time as not being afraid to at the same time build in a revenue source. We need to, I think smarter in that way about growing the pie and maybe even thinking about different flavours.
And Gerald, I know you wanted to speak, but I'm actually going to cut you off because I think we've gone
Such
a
a good
long
question,
way
Jane. I'll
from
tell you
what
afterwards.
Jane's question was. So I think we just do need to move along. So is there another question from here up the back here? Thank you.
G'day. I think health promoters working in the community spend a lot of time explaining what health promotion is and what they do. And this kind of leads on a bit from Jane's question just before. Very early on, when I was a very baby health promoter, someone said to me, the strongest social marketing that prevention can be involved with is the social marketing of itself. And I wonder...
And your question, please?
I wonder, do you think that's true? Or do you think we're just too precious as a sector and we need to get over ourselves?
I reckon that's what Rob was saying, actually. But Gerald, would you like to pick that one up?
Before Rob has a go at that, probably a bit about how I was going to answer Jane answers this one as well. I think that we are incredibly good as a sector at talking to ourselves really, really well. We talk to each other all the time and we tell each other how bright we are and how fantastic we are. But actually, Sandro's approach of a new way of thinking about how to talk differently to the people that most need to be influenced, how you can actually build that social movement so that you are then giving the coverage to the politicians. Again, as Sandro was saying, you've got to be able to give coverage to the politicians who possibly do want to take that big step out and make that big change. But they've got to know that they're going to be supported. So we have to be able to get better at communicating to the general population, and whether that's via a book in Kmart or whether that's via just how we communicate when we go to an event or a conference, or what we do on Twitter and how we communicate with the people that we connect with. I think that's a really critical piece for
Rob,
us.
did you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I mean, and as a medical practitioner, we have to have a much better dialogue with the medical profession. If you really look at those who are involved in treatment, working in tertiary, quaternary hospitals, then many of them won't be supportive of prevention health promotion at all. They may not understand it. They've got to deal with the emergencies that are in front of them, and yet they may argue against it. So, in your local community, get all of them on side, because they actually have a powerful voice as well. So it's learning how to work with different people. As I say, I've learnt more from people outside the health promotion sector, learned from digital strategists. Just to learn what I don't know is actually quite important in the long run. I've learnt from business people. Why? Because I've got really good processes that I could learn from.
Yeah, great. Adam, anything else on a text or from coming in on Facebook?
Yes, I've got one on the text line here. It's a question. How do we get industry to make the changes we need to improve nutrition in our food supply?
Ooh,
Quite specific.
Policy.
that was a simple answer. One word? Are we all happy with that?
Well, Rob, do you want to add? I said policy.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's
Regulation.
but it is. These things are not as simple. Sometimes you have to argue that some people shouldn't be around the table to make policy.
Yeah.
So if you've got groups who are utterly conflicted and will undermine it, then you have to change who sits around the table. And when we started the Preventive Health Task Force, then we didn't have to talk to the tobacco industry, but we had to talk to the food and alcohol industry.
Everyone else was on the list.
And then they managed to undermine everything we did over the next 8 years. So you just have to be careful of who's making the policy.
I'll just quickly add as well. Policy, I say policy with a bit of cheekiness, but a lot of the policy that we want may not happen anytime soon. And so we also need to think of other ways to cleverly get around that. And I think two great examples that I've come across very recently. One is a new benchmarking process that is being launched basically to benchmark companies against the SDGs. So you end up with hopefully a race to the top, and you end up with the bottom third being terribly embarrassed. That's one way. There are indices that do that and are very effective. Another is to actually, and increasingly, again, the investor community. I was speaking with the investor community, an organisation in Geneva that looks after $170 billion worth of investments. And they said the only thing that they knew about obesity and the single biggest influencer for them was the McKinsey report. In public health, most of us never read it. But the fact that it said there was going to be a 20% drag on GDP, that made the headlines in their community and changed investment behaviour. And ultimately, if you go through the process, as I did with 100 students in Copenhagen a few months ago, of mapping out the accountability and power flows in society, first in the society that we think we live in and that we're told we live in, the democracy, and then in the society that we actually live in and how democracy actually functions, you realise that whilst the private sector does, and portions of the private sector, and I use that because otherwise I'm going to get in trouble for speaking too long, the private sector does have a very powerful role in influencing policy, but ultimately it's not, the scariest part of the private sector is that it is a ship with no one at the helm, because the CEO is beholden to the board, and the board is beholden to shareholders, and shareholders don't even know that they're invested. We're all probably invested in a bunch of food companies. So you actually have no one at the helm. So then how do you influence that kind of ecosystem if you can't get policy? Well, the investor community is one very powerful way of doing that. So the investor community and benchmarking, indices that benchmark companies and force them to kind of either race to the top or embarrass the bottom third, they are two ways in the absence of policy of trying to kind of get something similar.
And great example of that with the work that Bronwyn's done in terms of working with super funds to get them out of
Absolutely,
tobacco
yeah.
is a terrific
Tobacco-free
example of that. Another question from here. Sam.
Thanks very much, guys. Shifting for a moment from food to tobacco, I mean, we've made huge progress here in Australia, led by Vic Health, among others, here in Victoria. How do we get to zero? Can we get to zero smokers in this country, and how do we do it?
Well, I mean, I think we'll never get to zero by virtue. I mean, the notion that what New Zealand's introduced about less than 5% is, in a sense, is the new zero. It's interesting. But I think, I mean, I would have, I don't know, sort of maybe 6 months ago said, yes, well, I mean, Australia has been on track and is doing relatively well, but, I mean, we're losing the battle globally. We forget that here. You know, we forget the fact that 40% of Indonesian 13 to 14-year-old boys smoke. And we've seen now just the rise, I mean, sort of the phoenix of Philip Morris International coming out with, now they, in a sense, they started to own the e-cigarettes. Now they're bringing out IQOS, the heat-treated tobaccos, so the new form of smoking that, you know, won't harm you. And they've just spent $3 billion on developing these, at the same time as they are putting more and more money into standard, as we would call them, cancer sticks in the developing world. And, you know, that's a major problem. At the same time as they're putting in so-called $1 billion into a foundation called the Foundation for a Smoke-Free World, led by Derek Yak. That makes me utterly sick. You know, they are not going to disappear. They are not going to disappear. So it means that we have to work harder and harder. In a sense, Quit's got a harder and harder job. Vic Health's got a harder and harder job here than I ever thought. But they are not going to lie down. And globally, they are incredibly sticky, resilient, and incredibly profitable.
And I think locally here, and I see Sarah's here today from Quit, and it's fantastic to have that organisation here working in Victoria with that incredible singular focus. And I like the idea of, you know, 5% is the new zero. But if you think about it just in Victoria and the population that we have of international students that come, and how just maintaining the level of smoking that we have now is actually going to be incredibly challenging in and of itself, is going to be something that we've got to look forward over the next few years, but also the pivot, I think, to how we can work with those people that are smoking that are in the places where they've got comorbidities. So they're in disadvantaged areas. They're also not just smoking, they're drinking, they're also eating unhealthily, and they're probably gambling as well. So how do we wrap up some of the discussions that we're having and some of the ways in which we're working and how we're collaborating to actually address those people in the population and the way that, and the places where they live and where they learn and where they work and play, how do we help on that front from a public health perspective, I think is incredibly important too.
Yep. Agreed, Jill. Another question from the floor here? Margot.
Thank you. This has been very interesting. And my common question goes back to what was spoken about previously. I'm wondering about whether or not there's a self-righteousness about health promotion that comes through with some of the messaging. And Sandro, your comments are sort of slightly combative. We've got to deal with all these threats, and people want to annihilate organisations that do good in the world. So is it about the language? What's the value proposition? How do you sell it? And how does that fit in with identity politics when Mia Freedman, for example, gets into trouble because she writes something that fat shames a woman? So everybody's got their rights and no one wants to be told what to do and how to do it.
Good question.
Really, really good question. And I was actually going to bring up language. I mean, it's such an important issue, and I can think of a couple of anecdotes. I literally just came from an interview with ABC Radio National. I was asked by The Conversation earlier this month to write an article responding to, you know, why bother being healthy? You've got to die of something. We all hear that all the time. But trying to write that article without it sounding as though I was, you know, saying that it's personal responsibility and we all just need to kind of get out of bed and go for a run. was really difficult. The issue of 2/3 of Australians are now overweight or obese. So of course there's a normative push now, or there will be a normative evolution towards kind of overweight being normal, because it is normal in the sense of it's the norm. So how do you then balance the need to have really tough discussions about obesity with fat shaming? I mean, it's a huge challenge. How do you balance, the fact that we do at the end of the day put food in our mouths? We're not held down and forced to eat something, but at the same time, I kind of think in many ways we are, but maybe not physically, but we know advertising and the studies that a 6-month-old can start to link, marketing with products. I mean, it's 6 months. That's indoctrination, surely. This week, I had a fascinating conversation with someone from the industry, who thinks that I'm a proponent of kind of this grey Orwellian world because I believe in fiscal policies as part of a comprehensive approach to obesity. And it just blew me away that was the viewpoint that they came from, and that the language I use, even policy. I walked out of this interview today and I thought, gosh, I'm not even sure the word policy is a great word to use, because I get so caught up in being in Geneva and everyone said, like, we use the P word all the time, but actually it kind of there's a visceral reaction for a lot of people in society to the P word, and I think I have to be much more careful not to use it. A final example is NCDs. Some people ask me, Sandra, I thought you've always talked about NCDs. I don't hear you talking about NCDs anymore. It's like, for me, non-communicable diseases are an internal narrative. It's like health in all policies. It's like malnutrition in all its forms. It doesn't mean a lot to most people. And we can spend 10 years teaching the public what non-communicable diseases means, which is a complete waste of time, or, which I only realise, I know, ironically, going back 3 years, 3 years ago, that's exactly what I was doing. Or we can spend the 30 seconds we have with the public, with the politician, whatever, telling them clearly what the solutions are and what the solutions to multiple problems are. And we have to find ways of framing it in a way that is compelling, relatable, but also not from our ivory tower, that is actually means something to them and not just to us. So lose the P word, lose the N word, and language is a huge challenge.
Rob, can I ask you to quickly comment, and then I'm conscious we're coming into the last few minutes of this discussion.
One example is actually when I was at Vic Health was the whole social and economic determinants of health, and how does that relate to local councils. We dropped it, we didn't use it. We used leading the way. And had a discussion around that. But we can learn quickly from our opponents in terms of being creative about the way we frame things. They're saying, well, admit that it's a serious problem, but not a life-threatening one. Admit that there may be a problem, but it's less severe than everybody says. Admit that the problem is less severe than other problems. That should be the priority. Argue that the cost to fix the problem is too high. In other words, $1 billion solution to $1 million problem. Argue that the benefits of the problem haven't been considered. Argue that the other options haven't been considered. Use colourful and derogatory language. What they do in the US is they use watermelons. So these are people they're environmentalists. Green on the outside, but they're really red on the inside. Yeah, so we can be as colourful and creative, and we have, that's where we need to go.
Adam, do we have something else that's coming in on Facebook or a text from here, which we can quickly answer?
Whether you can do it quickly or not, there's been a few questions about vulnerable communities, so-called, or Indigenous or LGBTI, and I guess how important it is to engage and target these communities as opposed to kind of the broader sort of general population approach.
Gerald, do you want to comment about that?
Well, certainly Vic Health's done some fantastic work in that area, and the Fair Foundations framework that the team built up based on the WHO work has been really a seminal piece, I think, for the organisation, but also for many of the partners that we have in Victoria. And it was a piece of work that was created in collaboration with many of the partners that we work with. So it's a tool that can really be used by not just the P word, the policy makers, but by the very people and the very organisations that we know we need to be working with, who are under-resourced and who often struggle day to day to be able to really thinking about what are the things that we can do to put in place to leverage the type of change that needs to happen. We've done some big pieces certainly, and probably the thing that springs to mind is our work with St Kilda Football Club and La Trobe University around the Pride game, which is something that we've worked on behind the scenes for a very, very long time until it's kind of fallen into the mainstream. And this year, just to see the way that game, for those of you that are into the AFL, the fixture came out this week. And what was really interesting looking on Facebook was how many people were actually tweeting about the Pride round, and people that you wouldn't normally expect to be tweeting about something so important. And also how the movement that has happened underneath that Pride game, all the communities and the very many community organisations and local sports organisations, particularly in the Gippsland area, which is kind of interesting, that are actually running community level Pride rounds. So it's interesting how that something that you work on behind the scenes, you know, that you build up the evidence around. You've got to convince multiple partners in order to take that big step and make a big public statement. You have some strong leaders, but then the ripple effect that happens has been quite profound, I think. But certainly looking at the Fair Foundations framework, for anybody that's interested in really how to be working systematically with vulnerable communities is a great tool.
I think we're probably going to have to start to bring this to a close. So, Rob, did you have a sort of final quick statement you'd like to make or a comment?
I think in health promotion, it is really about, Gerald's talking about partnerships. I mean, how do we leverage each other's capacity? How do we actually know more about each other in different sectors within our society, in different communities? How do we support each other, both at a village level, if you like, at a community level, at a state level, Australia, but I'm very interested in as Sandro is, I'm sure, in international solidarity. Partnerships really create an enormous power. We are normally good at it. I guess we just have to be the best at it, because that's the way that I think we'll be able to manage and so many of these health challenges that are in front of us.
Sandro, for you.
Yeah, I'm going to leave you with two challenges. One is to go and have a conversation like I had this week with my colleague who is an ex-Republican lobbyist. It was a fascinating experience. It was sobering and eye-opening, and I walked away with a lot to think about, and particularly the conversations around language and my own assumptions and the echo chamber that I live in. So have a conversation regularly with people who think completely differently from the way you do. And the second is to do that power mapping that we talked about. It was an interesting experience with these students in Copenhagen. We basically looked at the different blocks within society and where kind of policy and power should be and where it is in the real world we live in, and map that out and map out the power and accountability flows, and then think, well, where is it that we can actually disrupt within the resources that we have, the time that we have, the mandate that we have? What are the kind of different disruptive public health mechanisms that we could be using to try and drive, this important agenda forward?
And Gerald?
I think we're here on our 30th anniversary, and looking back, you can always learn some great lessons. And in health promotion, we are only 30 years old. It's not a sector that has been around for an incredibly long time. So looking back at so many of the successes that we've had, building upon those rich traditions, I think, as well as putting the innovation lens onto our work going forward is incredibly important. But what sits underneath it all is really partnerships. And for Vic Health, we have never existed without them. We will never exist without them going forward. And so those partnerships are, for us, and I think for everyone in this room, fundamental to how we're actually going to be addressing the next 30 years and addressing what is coming up over the hill. Some of the things we do know are coming over the hill, but there are many more that are bubbling away that we don't even know about yet. So I think keeping connected and making sure that we're having those conversations, not living in the echo chamber that sometimes we live in, is incredibly important for us.
Thanks, Gerald. And I mean, that link, I think, between what we're actually able to do at a Victorian level, at a country level, at a global level, in our own region is just so incredibly important. Well, I think we've taken actually probably just a very small peek into the future. And it's both exciting, challenging, and I'd have to say slightly scary in terms of the things that we've really got to try and do.
It is exciting.
And that's the challenge, I think, for everybody that's actually here today in terms of how do we take this discussion and these issues forward, and for those of us that have joined us online. So it's been a fantastic ride. I've really enjoyed it. The hour's really flown by. I think we could have many more of these conversations, and maybe that's something for us to consider both at Vic Health and with other organisations that are here today, is how do we keep these conversations going into the future. I'd really like to thank our panellists who've just been absolutely fantastic. They were quite happy to sort of come on a journey with me with not a lot of guidance and direction, and I think they've done pretty well. So could we please thank our panellists? I really, really want to thank you all for just being a wonderful, wonderful audience, so engaged, really terrific questions. You've allowed me to badger you about sticking to time, so that's been terrific. And for those of you that have actually texted in your questions as well, and to our online audience as well, it's just been a wonderful opportunity for us to be able to share this conversation with you today. I'd also like to just thank the Wheeler Centre and the crew here for doing such a great job, and to our Vic Health staff who've also done a really terrific job. So a round of applause for everybody. And I suppose just a closing word to say, we never know where the journey goes and where your career might go. And I thought I might share for some of you know this story, but when I started out as a little girl growing up on a farm, my sights were set on perhaps, trying to escape being a farmer. Not that I'm against farmers, but I really wasn't entirely sure that that was the career that I really wanted. And my sights were set on possibly going to a secretarial college or doing something you'd expect a young girl of 16 to do. And my life changed when I was able to get a scholarship and go to Mount Lawley Technical College in WA, and that led me to working into a research laboratory in a microbiology lab at the University of Western Australia as a technical officer. The really interesting thing was that I got to work on a Rothmans funded research project back in the 70s that was actually looking for a safer cigarette. Now, the dialogue has sort of changed a lot. My journey has gone in some very different sort of directions from that particular approach, but it was a really interesting start to come in with that level of industry funding that was going into research that was being seen as exactly as Rob said about what they're doing, about obfuscating the evidence, really trying to prolong the debate, and the journey that that's led me on in terms of then moving away from that, becoming very interested in working in hospitals, wanting to look after people that actually had smoking-related diseases, into that P for policy sort of space and advocacy and health promotion and public health. So there's some really exciting opportunities. I wish you all a fantastic journey, particularly for our students and younger professionals in your career. There's so many ways that you can actually make a contribution. And I also just wanted to acknowledge the brains trust that's in this room here today, the Mike Daubs, the Gus Nossells, the others who've just made such a contribution to the good work. We've just got to keep that fight going. So thank you very much. Well done, folks.